The rain was pouring heavily that evening, the kind of rain that made the world feel smaller, quieter, and lonelier. I sat by the window of my tiny apartment, staring at the droplets racing down the glass. My hands were wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The sound of the rain was soothing, but it did little to ease the heaviness in my chest. I had just come back from my third job of the day, a late-night shift at a 24-hour diner. My feet ached, my back was stiff, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts I couldn't seem to quiet. It had been like this for years now. Work, sleep, repeat. No breaks, no vacations, no luxuries. Just survival. And then there was my sister, Clara. Clara, who was probably sipping champagne on a yacht in the Mediterranean right now. Clara, who had never worked a day in her life. Clara, who had everything handed to her on a silver platter while I scraped by, barely keeping my head above water. It wasn't always like this. We used to be close, Clara and I. When we were kids, we were inseparable. She was my best friend, my partner in crime. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Our parents started treating us differently. Clara was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And me? I was just there. I remember the first time I noticed it. I was 16 and Clara was 14. She had just won some minor piano competition, and our parents threw her a huge party. They bought her a brand new piano, hired a professional photographer, and invited half the neighborhood. I had just won a science fair that same week, but no one seemed to care. When I brought it up, my mom just shrugged and said, "That's nice, dear," before going back to fussing over Clara. At first, I thought it was just a phase. Maybe they were just proud of Clara's talent. But as the years went by, the favoritism only grew worse. Clara got the best clothes, the best schools, the best opportunities. And me? I got hand-me-downs and part-time jobs. When Clara turned 18, our parents gave her a brand new car. When I turned 18, I got a card with $20 in it. "You're more independent," my dad said when I asked why the difference. "You don't need us to spoil you." Spoil me? I wasn't asking for a car. I was asking for fairness. But I didn't say anything. I just swallowed my hurt and kept going. And then came the ultimate slap in the face. Last year, Clara announced that she wanted to travel the world. She said she needed to find herself and experience life. And our parents, they didn't just support her, they funded her. They paid for her flights, her hotels, her meals, her shopping sprees. They even gave her a monthly allowance so she wouldn't have to work. Meanwhile, I was working 3 jobs just to pay my rent and student loans. I hadn't taken a day off in years. I hadn't even left the state. And my parents, they didn't offer to help me. Not once. "You're strong, Mia," my mom said when I brought it up. "You don't need our help. Clara, she's different. She needs us." Different. That word stung more than I cared to admit. Was I not their daughter too? Did they not see how hard I was working, how much I was struggling? But I didn't argue. I just kept my head down and kept working. And Clara? She kept traveling. She sent us postcards from Paris, Rome, Bali, Tokyo. She posted pictures on social media, her smiling on a beach, her laughing at a fancy restaurant, her posing in front of famous landmarks. Every time I saw those pictures, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Jealousy? Resentment? Sadness? Maybe all of the above. And now, after a year of globetrotting, Clara was coming home. I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me was curious. What would she be like after a year of luxury and adventure? Would she be the same carefree, spoiled Clara? Or would she have changed? Another part of me was dreading it. I didn't know if I could handle seeing her again, knowing how unfair everything had been. I didn't know if I could smile and pretend everything was fine. But I didn't have a choice. She was coming home, and I would have to face her. The sound of my phone buzzing snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen and saw a text from my mom. "Clara's flight lands tomorrow at 3 p.m. We're picking her up from the airport. You should come too." I stared at the message for a long time before typing a reply. "I'll be there." The next day, I stood at the airport, nervously shifting from foot to foot. My parents were a few feet away, chatting excitedly. They had brought a welcome sign and a bouquet of flowers. I hadn't brought anything. As the minutes ticked by, my anxiety grew. What would I say to Clara? How would I act? Should I hug her? Smile? Pretend everything was fine? And then I saw her. Clara walked through the arrivals gate, looking like she had just stepped out of a fashion magazine. She was wearing a chic white dress and oversized sunglasses, her hair perfectly styled, her skin glowing. She looked happy, carefree, like she didn't have a worry in the world. My parents rushed forward, hugging her and showering her with compliments. I hung back, feeling like an outsider. After a few moments, Clara noticed me. She smiled and walked over, pulling me into a hug. Mia, it's so good to see you. Her voice was warm, but I couldn't help but notice how thin she felt. Had she always been this small? Hey, Clara, I said, forcing a smile. Welcome back. She pulled back and looked at me, her eyes scanning my face. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her expression, something like guilt or sadness. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. You look tired, she said, her tone light but her words cutting. I shrugged. Just been busy. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't really care. She turned back to our parents, chattering excitedly about her trip. As we walked to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Clara seemed different. Not just in the way she looked, but in the way she acted. There was a nervous energy about her, a restlessness that hadn't been there before. But I didn't say anything. I just followed along, listening to her stories and trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. That night, we all had dinner together at my parents' house. Clara dominated the conversation, talking non-stop about her travels. She told us about the places she'd been, the people she'd met, the things she'd seen. She made it sound like a fairy tale, like her life was perfect. But as the night went on, I started to notice little cracks in her facade. The way her hands trembled when she reached for her glass. The way she avoided eye contact when she talked about certain things. The way she kept checking her phone, like she was waiting for something, or someone. And then, out of nowhere, she dropped a bombshell. I'm thinking about moving back home, she said, her voice casual but her eyes darting nervously around the table. My parents immediately lit up, thrilled at the idea. But I just stared at her, trying to figure out what was really going on. Why? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Clara hesitated, her smile faltering for a moment. I miss being here. I miss you guys. It sounded like a lie, but I didn't push it. Not then. Over the next few weeks, Clara settled back into life at home. She spent most of her time lounging around the house, scrolling through her phone, or going out with old friends. She didn't talk much about her travels anymore, and whenever someone brought it up, she quickly changed the subject. I tried to ignore her, to focus on my own life. But it was hard. Every time I saw her, I felt that same mix of emotions: jealousy, resentment, sadness. And then there was the nagging feeling that something was wrong. One night, I came home from work to find Clara sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She looked lost. Hey, I said, setting my bag down. You okay? She jumped, like she hadn't noticed me come in. Yeah, I'm fine, she said quickly, forcing a smile. I hesitated, then sat down next to her. You sure? You seem off. She didn't answer right away. She just kept staring at the TV, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. And then, out of nowhere, she started crying. Clara's sobs were quiet but raw, the kind of crying that comes from a place deep inside, where pain has been buried for too long. I sat frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Clara and I hadn't been close in years, and seeing her like this, vulnerable, broken, was unsettling. I reached out tentatively, placing a hand on her shoulder. Clara, what's wrong? She shook her head, her tears falling faster. I can't do this anymore, she choked out between sobs. Do what? I asked, my voice soft but urgent. What's going on? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I waited, giving her space but staying close. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she took a deep, shuddering breath and looked up at me. It wasn't what you think, she whispered. The traveling, the pictures, the posts. It wasn't real. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? Clara wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her voice trembling as she spoke. I mean, it wasn't as perfect as it looked. I wasn't happy, Mia. Not really. I was running away. Running away from what? I asked, though a part of me already suspected the answer. From everything, she said, her voice breaking. From Mom and Dad, from their expectations, from myself. I stared at her, trying to process her words. Clara had always seemed so confident, so carefree. But now, sitting here with her, I could see the cracks in her facade. The way her hands trembled, the way her eyes darted around the room like she was afraid someone might overhear. What happened? I asked gently. She hesitated, then let out a bitter laugh. Where do I even start? The truth is, I didn't want to travel. Not really. I didn't know what else to do. Mom and Dad kept pushing me to live my best life, to explore the world, but it wasn't for me. It was for them. They wanted me to be this perfect, glamorous person, and I didn't know how to say no. I felt a pang of sympathy, but it was mixed with something else, frustration. So you just went along with it? Even though you didn't want to? Clara nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't know how to tell them the truth. I didn't want to disappoint them. But the more I traveled, the more I realized how empty it all felt. I was surrounded by all these beautiful places, all these amazing experiences, but I was lonely. So lonely. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so much time resenting her, envying her, that I hadn't stopped to consider how she might actually be feeling. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, my voice softer now. Clara shook her head. I didn't think anyone would understand. Especially not you. Me? I asked, surprised. She looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt. You've always been so strong, Mia. You've never needed anyone's help. You've always known who you are. And me? I've spent my whole life trying to figure that out, and I still don't know. I didn't know what to say. For years, I had seen Clara as the golden child, the one who had everything handed to her. But now, hearing her talk like this, I realized that maybe we weren't so different after all. Clara, I began, but she cut me off. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry for everything. For the way Mom and Dad treated you. For the way I treated you. I know it wasn't fair. And I know I can't make it up to you. But I needed you to know. I sat there in silence, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to be angry, to remind her of all the times I had been overlooked, all the times I had struggled while she lived a life of luxury. But another part of me, a bigger part, just felt sad. Sad for her, for me, for the way our family had fallen apart. I don't know what to say, I admitted finally. Clara nodded, like she had expected that. You don't have to say anything. I needed to tell you. I needed you to know that I see you, Mia. And I'm sorry. We sat there for a while, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. For the first time in years, it felt like we were actually seeing each other. Not as rivals, not as the golden child and the forgotten one, but as sisters. The next few days were strange. Clara and I didn't talk much about what had happened that night, but there was a new understanding between us. We started spending more time together, not out of obligation, but because we wanted to. We watched old movies, cooked meals together, and even went for walks around the neighborhood. It was nice. But there was still a tension in the air, a sense that something was unresolved. Clara's confession had opened a door, but there was so much more behind it. Things she hadn't said, things I hadn't asked. And then one evening, it all came crashing down. We were sitting in the living room, flipping through old photo albums, when Clara suddenly froze. Her eyes were fixed on a picture of us as kids, sitting on a swing set, laughing. Do you remember this? She asked, her voice soft. I nodded. Yeah. That was the summer before everything changed. Clara's expression darkened. Before I became the favorite, you mean? I didn't respond, but she didn't seem to expect me to. She just kept staring at the picture, her fingers tracing the edges. I always hated it, you know, she said after a moment. being the favorite. It felt like a weight. Like I had to be perfect all the time, or else I'd disappoint them. And no matter what I did, it was never enough. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? Mom and Dad adored you. Clara shook her head. They adored the idea of me. The perfect daughter. But they didn't really know me. Not the real me. And every time I tried to show them who I really was, they didn't want to see it. Her words struck a chord deep inside me. I had always thought Clara had it easy, but now I was starting to see that maybe her life hadn't been as perfect as it seemed. Clara, I began, but she cut me off again. There's something else, she said, her voice trembling. Something I haven't told you. I felt a knot form in my stomach. What is it? She took a deep breath, like she was steeling herself. When I was traveling, I met someone. Someone who changed everything. I stared at her, my heart pounding. Who? Clara hesitated, then whispered. His name was Daniel. And he wasn't a good person. Clara's voice was barely audible as she spoke, her eyes fixed on the photo album in her lap. Daniel was charming. At first, anyway. He was one of those people who could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. Like you were special. I stayed silent, letting her talk. Something about the way she said his name, like it carried a weight she couldn't quite bear, made me uneasy. We met in Paris, she continued, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the photo. He was staying at the same hotel as me. We started talking, and he seemed so interested in me. Not just in the superficial way, but in who I was. Or at least, that's what I thought. She paused, her breath hitching, and I could see the pain in her eyes. It didn't take long for things to change. At first, it was little things. He'd get jealous if I talked to other people. He'd make comments about what I was wearing, who I was spending time with. And then, it got worse. My stomach churned as I listened. I didn't like where this was going. He started controlling everything, Clara said, her voice trembling. Where I went, who I saw, what I did. If I tried to push back, he'd get angry. Really angry. And then he'd apologize, tell me he loved me, that he just wanted what was best for me. And I believed him. Every time. I felt a surge of anger, but I kept it in check. This wasn't about me. This was about Clara. Why didn't you leave? I asked gently. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. I kept thinking it would get better. That he would change. And I was scared. Scared of what he might do if I tried to leave. Scared of being alone. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always seen Clara as confident, fearless, but now I realized how much of that had been a facade. Underneath it all, she was just as vulnerable as anyone else. What happened? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Clara took a deep, shuddering breath. It all came to a head in Bali. We were staying at this beautiful resort, and everything seemed perfect. But then, he found out I had been talking to someone, a guy I met at the pool. He accused me of cheating, of betraying him. And he lost it. Her voice broke, and she wrapped her arms around herself, like she was trying to hold herself together. He screamed at me, threw things, said things I can't even repeat. And then he hit me. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Clara. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared. So I ran. I packed my things and left in the middle of the night. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I had to get away. I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. I'm so sorry, Clara. I had no idea. She looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt. I didn't want anyone to know. I was so ashamed. I thought if I just kept pretending everything was fine, it would be. But it's not. It's not fine. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was hold her hand and let her cry. The next few days were a blur. Clara and I spent a lot of time together, talking, crying, trying to make sense of everything. It was strange in a way. For so long, we had been so distant, so disconnected. But now, it felt like we were finally starting to bridge the gap between us. But there was still so much unresolved. Clara's relationship with Daniel, her struggles with our parents, the way she had been treated. It was all still there, simmering beneath the surface. And then one evening, everything came to a head. We were sitting in the kitchen, sipping tea and talking, when Clara suddenly went quiet. She stared into her cup, her expression distant. "There's something else," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. "What is it?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "When I left Bali, I didn't just leave because of Daniel. I left because I found out something. Something about him." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" Clara looked at me, her eyes filled with fear. "He wasn't who he said he was. He had a past, Mia. A dangerous one. And if he ever finds me..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The look in her eyes said it all. Clara's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. I stared at her, my mind racing. "What do you mean, he has a dangerous past? What kind of danger are we talking about?" She hesitated, her hands trembling as she set her teacup down. He's involved in things. Illegal things. I didn't know at first. He seemed so normal, so charming. But then I started noticing things. The way he'd disappear for days at a time, the way he'd get calls in the middle of the night and leave the room to answer them. And then, I found something. "What did you find?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara's eyes darted around the room, as if she was afraid someone might overhear. "One night, when he was asleep, I went through his phone. I know it was wrong, but I had to know. And what I found, it was worse than I could have imagined. Texts about money laundering, about smuggling, about people disappearing." My blood ran cold. "Clara, that's serious. Did you go to the police?" She shook her head, her face pale. "I wanted to, but I was too scared. Daniel has connections, Mia. Powerful ones. If I went to the police, he'd know. And if he found out I knew, I don't know what he'd do." I felt a surge of anger, not at Clara, but at the situation. How could someone like Daniel have so much power? How could he have hurt my sister and gotten away with it? "We have to do something," I said firmly. "We can't just let him get away with this." Clara looked at me, her eyes filled with fear. "Mia, you don't understand. He's dangerous. If he finds out I told you, if he finds out I'm here." Her voice broke, and I could see the terror in her eyes. She wasn't just scared, she was terrified. And for the first time, I realized just how much danger she was in. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Okay, we'll figure this out. But you can't keep this to yourself anymore. You need to tell Mom and Dad." Clara's eyes widened in panic. "No, they can't know. They'll freak out, and they'll call the police, and then Daniel will." "Clara," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You can't handle this alone. You need help. And whether you like it or not, Mom and Dad are part of this family. They need to know." She stared at me for a long moment, then finally nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Okay, but can you be there when I tell them?" I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Of course. I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, we sat down with our parents in the living room. The atmosphere was tense, and I could see the worry in their eyes as they looked at Clara. "What's going on?" my mom asked, her voice tinged with concern. "You girls look so serious." Clara took a deep breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." My parents exchanged a glance, their expressions growing more anxious. "What is it, sweetheart?" my dad asked. Clara hesitated, then began to speak. She told them everything. About Daniel, about the abuse, about his dangerous past. She didn't hold back, and by the time she was done, the room was silent. My mom was the first to react. She stood up, her face pale, and pulled Clara into a tight hug. "Oh, honey, why didn't you tell us? We could have helped you." Clara buried her face in my mom's shoulder, her body shaking with sobs. "I was scared. I didn't want you to worry. I didn't want you to think I was weak." My dad stood up too, his expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You're not weak, Clara. You're brave. And we're going to make sure this guy never hurts you again." I felt a surge of relief. For the first time in years, it felt like we were all on the same page. like we were finally a family again. But the relief didn't last long. A few days later, Clara's phone buzzed with a text. She froze when she saw it, her face going pale. "What is it?" I asked, my stomach sinking. She handed me the phone without a word. The text was from an unknown number, but the message was chilling. "I know where you are." The text on Clara's phone felt like a punch to the gut. I stared at it, my mind racing. "Clara, we need to call the police. Right now." She shook her head, her hands trembling as she took the phone back. "No, Mia. If we call the police, he'll know. He'll come after us. He's already coming after us." I snapped, my voice rising. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to show up." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and I immediately regretted my tone. She was scared, terrified, and I needed to be calm for her. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Okay, let's think this through. Does he know where we live? Does he know you're here with us?" She hesitated, then nodded. "He knows where Mom and Dad live." I mentioned it once when we were together. I didn't think. Her voice trailed off, and I could see the guilt in her eyes. She didn't need to finish the sentence. She hadn't thought it would come to this. "We need to tell Mom and Dad," I said firmly. "They need to know what's going on." Clara nodded, her face pale. "Okay, but can you be there when I tell them?" I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Of course. I'm not going anywhere." We found our parents in the kitchen, sitting at the table with their morning coffee. They looked up as we walked in, their expressions immediately shifting to concern. "What's wrong?" my mom asked, her eyes darting between us. Clara took a deep breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "There's something I need to tell you. Something serious." She told them about the text, her voice shaking as she spoke. By the time she was done, the room was silent. My dad was the first to react. He stood up, his face dark with anger. "That's it. We're calling the police." "No," Clara said, her voice desperate. "If we call the police, he'll know. He'll come after us." "He's already coming after us," my dad snapped, his voice rising. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to show up." "Dad's right," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We need to do something. But we need to be smart about it." My mom reached out and took Clara's hand, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "We'll figure this out, sweetheart. We'll keep you safe." Clara nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe we could protect her. And honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it either. Over the next few days, the tension in the house was palpable. We kept the doors locked, the curtains drawn, and the lights off at night. Every noise made us jump. Every car that drove by made us hold our breath. But Daniel didn't show up. At first, I thought maybe he was bluffing. Maybe he didn't really know where Clara was. But then one night we got another text. This time it was a picture. A picture of our house, taken from the street. The message underneath was simple: "I'm watching." The picture of our house sent a chill down my spine. I stared at it, my heart pounding, as Clara let out a choked sob beside me. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's really here." I grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We're not going to let him hurt you. We'll figure this out." But inside, I was terrified. Daniel wasn't just a threat. He was a predator. And he was closing in. My parents rushed into the room, their faces pale as they saw the picture on Clara's phone. "That's it," my dad said, his voice firm. "We're calling the police. Now." This time Clara didn't argue. She just nodded, her face pale and her hands shaking. The police arrived within minutes, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. They took Clara's statement, examined the texts, and promised to increase patrols in the area. But they also made it clear that without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. "We'll keep an eye out," one of the officers said, his tone sympathetic but firm. "But if he hasn't made any direct threats or attempts to contact you beyond these texts, our hands are tied." Clara nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't believe the police could protect her. And honestly, neither did I. That night, none of us slept. We sat in the living room, the lights off and the curtains drawn, listening for any sound outside. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, made us jump. Clara sat beside me, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry I brought this on all of you." I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "This isn't your fault, Clara. None of this is your fault." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "If I had just been smarter, if I had just seen him for what he was." "Stop," I said firmly. "You can't blame yourself for what he did. He's the one who's wrong, not you." She didn't respond, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe me, and I didn't know how to make her believe. The next few days were a blur of fear and tension. The police increased their patrols, but there was no sign of Daniel. The texts stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe he had given up. But then one night, we heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, just a rustling in the bushes. But then it grew louder, closer. My heart pounded as I grabbed Clara's hand, my eyes fixed on the window. "Stay here," my dad said, his voice low and tense. "I'll check it out." "No," Clara said, her voice desperate. "What if it's him? What if he's out there?" My dad hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, we'll all go. Together." We moved to the front door, my dad leading the way. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. At first, there was nothing, just the quiet stillness of the night. But then we saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the driveway. My heart stopped. It was him. It had to be. But as the figure stepped into the light, I realized it wasn't Daniel. It was a woman. The woman stepped closer, her face illuminated by the porch light. She was in her late 30s, with sharp features and a determined expression. Her eyes locked onto Clara, and for a moment, no one spoke. "Clara," the woman said, her voice steady but urgent. "I need to talk to you. It's about Daniel." Clara froze, her grip on my hand tightening. "Who are you?" The woman hesitated, then took a step forward. "My name is Elena. I was with Daniel before you. I know what he's capable of, and I know he's after you." My dad stepped in front of Clara, his protective instincts kicking in. "How do we know we can trust you? For all we know, you're working with him." Elena shook her head, her expression grim. "I'm not. I've been trying to get away from him for years. He's dangerous, and he doesn't stop until he gets what he wants. But if we work together, we can stop him." Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling. "What do you mean, stop him?" Elena's eyes softened as she looked at Clara. "I mean, we can take him down. For good. But we need to act fast. He's not going to wait much longer." We brought Elena inside, and she told us everything. She had been in a relationship with Daniel years ago, and like Clara, she had been drawn in by his charm. But it didn't take long for the abuse to start. "He's a master manipulator," Elena said, her voice bitter. "He knows how to make you feel like you're the problem, like you're the one who's wrong. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's too late." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I thought I was the only one." Elena reached out and took Clara's hand, her expression fierce. "You're not alone anymore. And we're not going to let him win." Over the next few days, Elena helped us come up with a plan. She had been gathering evidence against Daniel for years, recordings, documents, names of his associates. But she needed our help to make it stick. "We need to draw him out," Elena said. "We need to make him think he's in control, and then we hit him with everything we've got." It was risky, but we didn't have a choice. Daniel wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, and we couldn't live in fear forever. The plan was simple. Clara would agree to meet Daniel, but we'd have the police waiting nearby. Elena would provide the evidence, and together, we'd make sure he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. The night of the meeting, my heart was in my throat. Clara sat in the car, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. Elena was in the back seat, her expression calm but determined. "You can do this," I said, squeezing Clara's hand. "We're right here with you." She nodded, her eyes filled with fear but also resolve. "I'm ready." Daniel showed up exactly where Elena said he would. He stepped out of his car, his expression smug as he approached Clara. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You always come back." Clara took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "This ends tonight, Daniel." He laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "You really think you can get away from me? You're mine, Clara. You always will be." But before he could say another word, the police moved in. They surrounded him, their guns drawn, as Elena stepped out of the car with a folder full of evidence. "It's over, Daniel," Elena said, her voice firm. "You're done." Daniel was arrested that night, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. He was charged with multiple counts of abuse, fraud, and involvement in organized crime. It would be years before he saw the outside of a prison cell again. In the weeks that followed, our family began to heal. Clara started seeing a therapist, and for the first time in years, she seemed hopeful. My parents were more supportive than ever, and the tension between us slowly began to fade. One evening, Clara and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The air was warm, and the world felt quiet, peaceful. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice soft. "For everything." I smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "You don't have to thank me. You're my sister. I'll always be here for you." She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know. And I'm here for you too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. We had been through hell, but we had come out stronger. Together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were finally a family again.